Hello, everybody. My name is Austin Ruse. I am president of the Center for Family and Human Rights, otherwise known as CFAM. We have been in business since the summer of 1997, if you can imagine that. And our principal work is assisting UN delegations in negotiating UN documents, both binding and non-binding, in order to preserve the right to life, to make sure that abortion doesn't become an internationally recognized human right, to ensure that the family maintains its essential definition, and also to ensure that certain sexual peculiarities do not become a part of international law. This puts us at odds with the sexual left at the UN and around the world. The sexual left, which is in many ways ascendant and powerful, and they want to silence us. They do not want to debate. And this is why I have invited Stella Morabito to join us today. I have been a fan of Stella's now for many years. She is telling stories that hardly anybody else is. You know, Stanley Kurtz does some of this, as you know, but nobody does it quite as well as Stella. And she's connected to a wider world of academics, at least in her work, that have plowed these fields for many, many years. And I want to talk a little bit about Margaret Thayer Singer here in a little bit, because she's important to your work and to this whole effort. But Stella is an expert in Soviet propaganda, in the use of isolation and social isolation, to keep people silent, to the use of political correctness, and so much more. Stella spent some time at one of the three-letter agencies, specifically the CIA, and I'd kind of like to start there. What was what era were you? I mean, you were in the Soviet, in the Cold War era, but tell us a little bit about your time there and what you worked on.
Oh my goodness. Well, it was, early in my professional life, and it was maybe about a decade, and I'm giving my age away, but it was during the Reagan era in the 80s. And, an interesting thing I've kind of written about this is I did analysis, and I was in different offices, but primarily I did Soviet media analysis, propaganda, reading Pravda every day. And what's interesting is when you consider the analyst offices at the CIA at the time, and I'm sure even more so today, they were like faculty lounges. For the most part, people were pretty much on the left. I mean, surprisingly so, especially for that era. But I noticed, and this kind of plays into my thesis. I noticed how people just would go along with, just as you would get at a university, go along with this leftist sort of viewpoint of their branch chief or division chief, because those are the people who write up your performance appraisals, right? And I think it feeds into that, into my thesis of the fear of being isolated or marginalized. People tend to go along with propaganda if they see that as, as a form of self-preservation socially. Mm-hmm. And so, that's just a kind of a minor part of, where this all comes in. I mean, generally in the study of propaganda, especially Soviet propaganda coming from communist or totalitarian systems, they all play on a form of social psychology that people who are used to living in freedom don't really appreciate. And social psychology, if you study mob psychology and how people just kind of go along with the laws of mob psychology and groupthink, it all ties into the fear of being socially isolated, the fear of being considered an oddball.
And let me ask you, did you notice this in your work reading Soviet newspapers, or is this something that you came to later?
Oh, I think just, just the study of Russian history. I mean, I have a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history. And, I think anybody who reads about Stalin's reign of terror with an open mind um, can see this,
Yeah.
How, and you just look at, when the Bolsheviks took over and Lenin and the company basically said this is the end of private life. And you read, say, the Darkness at Noon, where, the story is about an old Bolshevik basically being, kind of hit by his own,
was that Kessler?
Pardon me?
Was that Kessler's book?
Kessler's book, Darkest at Noon. And, it's about how the revolution eats its own. And, but there, and you look also at what happened to Bukharin, who was Lenin's right-hand man, really, and how he was the prize. I mean, when you look at the show trials and how he was so cruelly executed, it was, it's very clear. They've all written about loneliness and how alone they felt. Bukharin, wrote about that in a lot of his letters. If you just look at the way these things all play out, it all boils down to the same weaponry, what I call the weaponry of loneliness. Weaponry, the threat of being socially isolated. And, it's a primal human fear. It's a primal human need to be connected with others in terms of survival and all of that. I mean, biologically as well as socially. And so it should come as no surprise that that is ultimately the weapon of choice. And yet people who are used to living in freedom just take that for granted. We don't think in terms of how, it would never occur to us to do that to someone else. But it's all part of the totalitarian mindset. And so they use the greatest tool at their disposal, which is, that threat of being socially isolated, ostracized, rejected. And they've used it to great effect, partly because people of goodwill are so unaware of how it's being used and unaware of how easily manipulated we are as human beings.
Talk a little bit about the political correctness, where it came from, how it is used, what it means.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, it has a long history, but we'll just go back to say where it came from. If you want to get academic about it, we can look at Herbert Marcuse, who was that member of the Frankfurt School. You can read about in Michael Walsh's fantastic book about critical theory, The Devil's Pleasure Palace.
Yep.
And Marcuse came up with this theory called repressive tolerance, which I think it really kind of sowed the seeds of political correctness in the United States. He was a professor, UC San Diego, and but he came, he's all part of the Frankfurt School, and promoted the idea of the long march through the institutions, but also mainly stated that repressive tolerance meant that, the worldview or the mindset, or however he portrayed it, of people who love freedom or adhered to Western tenets of liberty and openness, that they should not really be allowed to speak because they're pushing out other, the leftist point of view. I mean, he knew that the leftist basically totalitarian
You know,
mind.
I remember in the 80s when I worked at Rolling Stone and hung out with a much hipper crowd than I know now. Saying something was politically incorrect was almost tongue in cheek in those days. I have vivid memories of people joking, "Oh, that's not politically, that's politically incorrect." But it has a quite a nefarious purpose, and that is to stop people from talking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. To what end?
And I'm to get back to that. You know, we're trying to talk about the history of it.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about Marcuse too much, but yes, it is designed to induce self-censorship.
Right.
And when you think about that, when you through the threat of being separated from others, socially rejected, people, they self-censor because they don't talk to their neighbors, they don't talk to their classmates, coworkers about things that are on their mind the way they might have 20, 30 years ago, because the punishment is so intense. I mean, to be ostracized is social death. It's like Barry Weiss or someone said, social murder, and that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to create a spiral of silence for what is actually a majority view, and make it look like a minority view, as if it loses circulation in public discourse. Right. So the idea, for example, the transgender thing, 10 years ago, even really 5 years ago, I mean, before the Bruce Jenner Vanity Fair cover came out with him to Call Me Caitlin, most people would just say, the biological reality is that, the human race is dimorphic. There's male, female, some anomalies, but the anomalies, intersex, they basically prove the rule. The exceptions prove the rule. And so most people, wouldn't have a problem expressing that. And now, because there is such a monopoly in the mainstream media that enforces this totalitarian mindset that only they can say what is real or what is true, people become very, very fearful of expressing the truth. And the problem with that is, because of this fear of social isolation, when people respond by self-censoring, all they are doing is creating more isolation. Yeah. That's the tragedy, is that by succumbing to it, you paint yourself into a corner.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
When I was helping market Michael Walsh's book, The Devil's Pleasure Palace, it had gone out, it had been published, and then it went away, and I discovered it and started pumping it in Washington and brought him to the UN with you. Oh gosh, I just lost my train of thought. Anyway, with regard to social isolation, what is the most toxic? What is the most toxic thing these days besides transgenderism? Is it race? Can one say that they do not like Black Lives Matter, for instance?
Oh yeah, I mean, they, as is often the case, disguise their power mongering. They use the fig leaf of some kind of equality and justice, sentiment that nobody in their right mind would disagree with. Yeah, Black Lives Matter. I mean, the sentiment is, anybody of goodwill understands that. But, the positioning of the strategy, the tactics behind it, is to just use that sentiment to cover up a totalitarian agenda, an agenda that's meant to control everybody's lives. I think, well, can you repeat the essence of that question? I had another point I wanted to make about that.
In one of your columns, you said that even forcing people to say Black Lives Matter is a form of brainwashing, not unlike the easy things that the Chinese made American POWs in the Korean War say.
Oh yeah, yeah. That and it's kind of a slow drip that's used to pull you in. Yeah, the Chinese, when they got hold of American POWs in Korea and during the Korean War, used a kind of what they call a lenient form of brainwashing, which is actually more insidious, where they just, just write things down like, oh, America is not perfect. Well, okay, that's true, of course. In a communist country, everybody works. Well, maybe. I mean, everybody's a slave, in my opinion. So everybody works. But they would just pull you in, and as you succumbed to their tactics and methods, you became more and more colored by the whole, by the propaganda.
Right.
And it was pretty astonishing. Psychiatrists who examined the POWs when they returned to America were just kind of astounded by how effective the brainwashing was. But mostly, to get people to write things down, it's sort of a commitment sort of thing. And they do that in the critical race theory workshops and things like that.
And I want to talk about critical race theory, but just for 1 second, a great example of this kind of political correctness is people who responded to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter were hammered.
Oh yeah.
Were hammered.
Right.
And I believe some people lost their jobs because they said all lives matter, because it was labeled as racist and therefore quite beyond the bounds of polite society. This is totalitarian.
Absolutely. And it's astonishing how far we've fallen. You had talked originally, you were asking me about the issue of race. When it comes to, so I see the twin viruses today as, political correctness and identity politics.
Right.
Both of which serve slightly different purposes together. They're a really toxic brew. Identity politics is really designed to destabilize individual identity. That's the way I see it. Because what it says is that you're not really a unique human being in your own right with different experiences, suffering, or any of that. We are going to assign you an identity based on, they call it intersectionality. All the different groups that you might belong to, white, male, whatever. And so they have all these different, intersections of demographics. And so you get like a score, and the score is based on whether you can be classified. Again, you're classified. You're no longer an individual human being with a unique identity. You are classified as either an oppressor or a victim. And if you're an oppressor, your only out is to become a, quote, ally of victims. But you're not human. It's very dehumanizing. And what they're doing in the schools with the gender ideology that they, as young as preschool, is destabilizing a child's ability to develop their own personal identity by telling them that they're neither male nor female, or nobody is, that you just pick whether you're male or female. And so, that's the other thing people don't understand about transgenderism. It is meant to be applied universally. It's not about just the transgender person. When they use that phrase, that premise that is embedded in all of the laws, the so-called anti-discrimination laws, they just use the phrase sex assigned at birth.
Right.
And that's not meant to just apply to a transgender. That's meant to apply across the board.
Right.
We're all, ambiguous. We are all, whatever we think we are in our minds. We're not. There is no physical reality, which of course has huge repercussions for human relationships. And I get
One
back
of
to
one of the more foul terms that we come across these days, besides transgender, is cisgender. And
oh,
whenever that comes up in social media, and I'm talking to people, I just say there's no such thing. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as cisgender. There's no such thing as transgender. All of this is a gruesome lie.
exactly. Yeah. No, it's just meant to antagonize and to sow hostilities between people so that they cannot relate to one another as unique human beings who have, just a whole panoply of different experiences, suffering. No, that none of that's appreciated.
Yeah,
It's dehumanizing. It's meant to
that's right.
dehumanize, separate, and create hostilities,
That's right.
and
That's
and
right.
and especially destabilize.
What I was trying to think of a minute ago about when we were promoting Michael Walsh's Devil's Pleasure Palace was at the time I wrote a column called "I No Longer Say Chair." In the UN, where we spend most of our time, you can't say chairman. You can't even say chairwoman. You have to say chair. This is a kind of political correctness, and it seems to me that we need to in culture and in these linguistic fights is establish a kind of Inchon landing. When Douglas MacArthur went around the North Vietnamese when they had invaded South Korea and attacked them from the rear. We need to go back to previous times and say, you know what? I'm not going to say
Mhm.
American. I'm not going to say Native American. I'm going to say Indian. I'm not going to say African American. I'm going to say Black. I'm not going to say chair. I'm going to say chairman. It seems to me that we have to do an Inchon landing behind enemy lines on these things
Mhm.
to somehow fight back, because bit by bit, just like the Chinese torturers of the American soldiers in Korea, they're making us go along bit by bit with their whole ideology and their whole agenda.
Right. Oh, yeah. And they know that people who resist, they punish them to be examples for everybody else. And
Yeah.
everybody else tends to go along because the fear that this is terrorism. This is a form of intellectual terrorism and emotional terrorism. And I mean, what they're doing. I have pretty much decided that I am no longer going to allow anybody to identify me as white. I am going to reject it. I reject being called white because this is used in the most insidious ways. White supremacist, whiteness, forget it. I have a name. My name is Stella. I have experiences, that are unique to me. I have a mind, and I'm going to use it. And if they have a problem with that, I suppose they'll punish me. But this is to allow them to. This is one of the worst things, to allow them to force you to, quote, identify as white. Now, when I say I'm female, that's just, that's not an identity. I mean, it is an identity, but it's more what I am. I am female. I don't have, female, quote, gender.
Yeah.
I don't use the word gender. Am female because, I mean, that is the only real distinction in humanity as a biological species is we're dimorphic. And yeah, there's all kinds of other, ethnicities and all of that. But to be human is to be either male or female. And as far as the intersex is concerned, I just say everybody who has an intersex condition came about through the union of one male and one female. And it doesn't matter. It could happen in a petri dish or, traditionally, however it happened. That's a derailing, outlier that they use, an outlier they use to derail. But anyway, you can't accept the lexicon that's being forced.
I like to torment them by referring to myself as a person of color.
Yeah, there you go.
Because I like to point out that I like to think that I'm beige, but my wife insists that I'm pink.
There you well, see, you're going to have that debate. Yeah.
You know, and I
don't
think
know.
that there was a time in America when Italians, I think, weren't considered white.
Oh, that's right. In fact, I think Michael Walsh in his book mentions that the first lynchings were of Italians.
Is that right?
I think so. Yeah, in early, I don't know, late 19th, early 20th century. I don't know. Don't quote me, but I
Well,
believe.
I want our listeners, which are numerous at this point. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. That we will be taking questions. There's a Q&A feature, which is somewhere on this interface that you should log your questions, and we will get to them in about 10 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about Margaret Thayer Singer, who was a seminal figure in this field, who was tasked by the American Psychological Association to draft a document, a paper, a book on cults. And tell us what happened.
Oh, yeah. Well, she was defamed because she was exposing the methods of cults, and totalitarians are all cultists. I mean, they dictate to reality how reality should be, according to Hugh Smearlow, who wrote about that in his book, The Rape of the Mind. So Margaret Thayer Singer, after the, all the cult activity of the 70s, I don't know how many of your listeners would be aware, but the 60s also, you had the Manson cult and Charles Manson, but in the 70s, you had the Stockholm bank robbery, where the term Stockholm syndrome came from, where and again, isolation. The captives were in such isolation that they depended on the captor. And so Stockholm syndrome is the phenomenon whereby the captive bonds with the captor. And the hostages, even afterwards, wouldn't testify against the captors. But then the year after that, the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army kidnapped Patty Hearst. What is the first thing they did to her? They stuck her in a closet for 6 weeks, isolated her. So and then during that time, engaged her in Maoist type struggle sessions, where basically telling her father was a fascist, KKK, all this America stuff. And she bonded with them, she depended on them for food and, her, survival. And she disengaged. Her whole identity was totally destabilized. Okay, so there was that. And then, of course, the Jonestown Massacre in 1978. Where you had like 1,000 people in Jonestown, Guyana, all drink, where the term "drinking the Kool-Aid" comes from, when the leader Jim Jones knew that he was had, and so he had everybody. He basically murdered everybody by forcing them to drink the cyanide punch.
But not forcing them; they did it voluntarily.
Well, this is where the fear of isolation and the cult mindset comes in,
right,
where their identities are so, that's the other thing he did. He isolated them physically in the jungle of Guyana. I mean, where there's no way out. And this is what we're seeing in the buildup to the so-called, the reset, the globalist agenda. There's no way out. And so anyway, the isolation is key to all cults and cult leaders and totalitarians of all stripes. And so Margaret Thayer Singer, getting back to her, after all of this happened, the United States was still a nation of, respect for rule of law and understanding about these things. So they tasked her, and she was a phenomenal expert on cults, with coming up with something for Americans to, kind of as a public service, understand how cults operate. That it doesn't matter what they believe. You could have a cult, of UFO enthusiasts, right? I mean, you could have a cult of, there could be benign cults, following of a movie or whatever. But she was talking about destructive cults that operate by destabilizing identity and sense of self, and bringing you in under the control of, and losing your freedom. And so she, after a couple years, put together this, it was called the DIMPACT Report, Deceptive and Indirect Means of Influence and Persuasion. Persuasion and influence. Anyway, she had charts of, how coercive thought reform works, coercive thought reform being another word for brainwashing, and how, cults, it's not the content of a cult that defines a cult.
This is interesting to me.
That they use, the tactics and the methods they use to break down identity and to pull you in. What was
because the purpose is to follow a leader and not necessarily to adopt an ideology, but to follow a particular leader and do what they say.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all about them. I mean, that's how totalitarians operate. They use these little ideologies, whether it's feminism or transgenders or whatever. Now, there's a lot of followers who don't, but the leaders behind these things, basically, they operate as they just want to control people. And how do you control people? You isolate them. You control their personal relationships. So you break down family bonds, you break down friendship bonds, you break down, all kinds of, things we take for granted or have taken for granted in a free society, the freedom of association in particular. And that's what political correctness is designed to disrupt. It's what identity politics is designed to disrupt. And so what you end up with is, just this monolithic control and this monopoly over what you're allowed to think and whom you're allowed to associate with.
Singer's study was rejected by the APA.
Yeah, and as always, they had a couple of outside experts come in and basically trash it as, well, it's not really, brainwashing is not a scholarly concept, that kind of stuff. And again,
what they call a conspiracy theory these days, a neat way to dismiss whatever is really happening.
Exactly. And in fact, I think Cheryl Atkinson points out in her book, The Smear, that the term conspiracy theory and theorist was actually concocted by the Soviets in the 50s, because whenever somebody's like hovering right over the target, they what do? I mean, it goes right back again to inducing the fear of being socially rejected. Oh, conspiracy theorists, you're crazy. Everybody's going to think of you as crazy if you say, freedom is not slavery. So it's a smear. It's part of what Laird Wilcox called ritual defamation, and it's used to silence. And the best means of silencing people is the threat of ostracism.
Now, Laird Wilcox was a researcher at the University of Kansas. Is that right?
Kansas, yeah. They even have a Wilcox Center. I don't know. I mean, he's very outspoken now about ritual defamation. That was a very famous essay that he wrote. It's very short, and he collected all kinds of. They have a huge collection at the University of Kansas named for him. I don't know how much longer because of, how these totalitarians operate. But at the University of Kansas, he collected all kinds of literature and pamphlets and tracts. And I mean, I think there are tens of thousands, if not 100,000 pieces of literature in there that refer to all these different groups that you had back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And their literature, whether it was.
And he also postulates, and the only reason I know this is because there's a fellow that I know who's an editor at the American Conservative named Jordan Bloom. Jordan is an expert on Laird, and I think wrote his master's thesis on his work, and that much of what Laird looked at with regard to these right-wing organizations back in the day was that they were, many of them, or perhaps all of them, infiltrated and kind of run by the federal government, by members of the FBI, in order to subvert I don't want to get out over my skis, but there's a very interesting governmental aspect to Laird Wilcox's work.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware. I'll look into that. You know, after
I should put you in touch with Jordan Bloom. Do you know Jordan?
No, I don't think so.
He was the op-ed editor of the Daily Caller for many years, and then I think he went off and got a master's degree. He's back, and now he's the one of the top editors at the American Conservative. Very, very good and solid guy. Do you see any parallels between COVID-19 measures and what we're being asked to do? I mean, I know that you do. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, it's all about isolation. It's really criminal when you think about it. Yeah, obviously there's a bad flu. It's a very bad flu. It's a virulent strain. It's I'm not going to belittle you know, any kind of illness that has, you know, such you know, an impact. You know, I won't get into all the, you know, where it came from and all that, but what it amounts to is a really virulent viral strain of flu, but it's basically the flu. And you know, we had a huge pandemic. I've forgotten how many in the United States died from it in 1957. That was another Asian flu, but it didn't shut down all of society. It didn't tell you that you couldn't gather with your family at Thanksgiving. It didn't tell you, you know, what's happening now is so blatantly and obviously cover for social control. I mean, I'm sorry. You call me whatever you want, conspiracy theory, whatever. It's so obvious. And everybody I talk to sees it unless they are just overwhelmed with fear of germs, you know. But
hasn't public health from time to time in history been used as a cover for social control?
Oh yeah, of course. Public safety.
Public safety.
Yeah. I think there's a writer, James Polis, who came out with a 4-part series, what he called the Pink Police State, back in about 6-7 years ago. For the Federalist, wrote it up, and you know how yeah, I mean, we see it. It's just all under cover of public safety. BC, I mean, it's like Gavin Newsom, you know, coming out, and of course they live high on the hog, and they go and they ignore all of this, Pelosi and all of them. They just do whatever they want, and we little people are, you know, all, you know, there just for their control, and
you know, I have to say that in my own life, with regard to fear of isolation, you know, I'm generally not that fearful because I'm way out there on a whole lot of issues, and you can read my Wikipedia page to see the attacks from the left on me and my work. But for a good long while, I did not wear a mask really anywhere, and certainly not at the grocery store. And in the early days of COVID, I wasn't the only one. But about 6 weeks ago, I noticed at the grocery store, I was the only one.
Oh, I've had that. Yeah.
I was the only one. And you know what? I put on my mask. I did not want to be the only one.
Oh, yeah.
Be the only one. So yeah, I mean, that fear of being the only one is very powerful. And one of the frightening things, and this is one reason I want you to come to my daughter's school and talk about this, is what young people are experiencing. Not in my daughter's school, but going forward, they will.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There, in my next book called No Finer Time to Be a Faithful Catholic, I talk about a Pew study that showed that college students are less afraid of their left-wing professors than they are of their peers. Why? Social isolation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, and youth are so susceptible. They are so susceptible because, you know, you're going through periods where, I mean, well, everybody has that susceptibility to that threat and that fear, there's nothing worse. I mean, prisoners will say the worst punishment is solitary confinement. Yeah. And what this COVID thing is doing is basically putting us each in a kind of a vault. That's political correctness, identity politics. It's a virtual solitary confinement. You know, you keep your thoughts to yourself unless you, you know, just kind of regurgitate what the official line is. Your associations are dictated by the official line. So if somebody has been tagged as a conspiracy theorist, you're not supposed to have, you shun them. It just colors all of society and all of life, and it's just misery.
You know, some years ago, there was a woman in our circles, in our policy circles, who was put on the Southern Poverty Law Center hate list. And I thought that she must have done something wrong. And then CFAM ended up on the list. And then many other organizations ended up on the list. And I realized then that no, she didn't do anything wrong. She just came across this new blacklist, which is what I've called it in a crisis column, where again, social isolation. So we've got about 15, 20 minutes left, and I want to move into some questions here. And we've just answered the question about, and I would ask all the viewers that to put your questions in the Q&A box. John Wills says, I concentrate on analysis to show that ideological fashion is nonsensical. My professional magazine, and he says, ACM, does not print my letters. They did long ago. How should I approach things? You know, that's such a hard question. How do you get past the barriers that have been established to keep us out?
Yeah, I mean, you know, part of the issue is that, you know, 90% of most people are not really gonna, are not really gonna go up against this sort of thing. And then there's really individuals like maybe 5–10% have to kind of lead the way in their resistance to all of this tyranny. When it comes to magazines that used to publish your stuff and don't anymore, or people used to be friends and distance themselves and all of that, how do you get around all that? Yeah. And I think in a free society, one of the things we've lost sight of is that old adage that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We have kind of assumed that our institutions, like, I mean, think about the FBI, for example, how corrupt it has become. We just kind of assume that things are not really corruptible when they are, if you let down your guard, very corruptible. I mean, all the institutions have been corrupted. So what do? You have to find ways to develop parallel institutions. I mean, just as like Hillsdale College is parallel to the corrupt university system, or homeschooling, or other schools that actually teach content knowledge and have a solid view of education. Those are parallel to the corrupt K-12 unionized government schooling project. And I mean, there's so many other parts of life, areas of life where you have to kind of build your own, what they call parallel policies. This was something came out of the Czech, what's his name, Václav Benda, and then Václav Havel expanded on that in his essay, The Power of the Powerless, that you've got to start really one-on-one with people you trust. And you've got to cultivate these personal relationships. And as excuse me, I'm going to have to make sure this doesn't ring.
Mine rang too.
Yeah. I don't know why. So as I lost my train of thought there, but
you were talking about building up parallel institutions to go around the gatekeepers.
That's right. It's the end run. However, we can't lose sight of the fact that these parallel institutions are also susceptible to corruption and infiltration. I mean, the totalitarian left is on a search and destroy mission for any sign of anybody who doesn't toe their line. So it has to be constant, has to be vigilant, it has to be more and more and more of these institutions, but they all start from what, Jacques Ellul, he was the brilliant, he's a sociologist who wrote Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. He wrote in like the 1960s, early 60s. And this, this point that he made, propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins. And we have to keep remembering that. Your inner circle, the people you trust, and it just has to ripple out. It's really the only way at this point or ever, but it's really the only way you've got it. And that's how you build the networks, and always with the understanding that the networks are targeted.
Yep.
It's a constant battle, and you can't let your guard down. But that's how you have to do it.
The frightening thing, though, is that there can be a tremendous personal cost.
Oh, yes.
To this type of thing. I for instance, I can never get another job than what I do. I could certainly never get a job in government. I mean, it's very funny because I was approached by the White House Personnel Office now 3 or 4 months ago, asking me if I would be interested in a job. And I said, I'm toxic. And they said, well, we're really looking for toxic people. So I possibly could have gotten, a job somewhere at USAID, was what they were talking about. And they're putting really wonderful people in USAID. But the guy that I know, Joe Sella, who's now the U.S. ambassador to Fiji, Vanuatu, Kiribati, he was up before the Senate committee interviewing him for that job. And Menendez, that snake from New Jersey, said, Mr. Sella, do you know a man named Austin Ruse?
Oh.
And he trotted out some egregious thing that I had said. And he said, do you agree with this? So it's like I'm even used against, people like that. But, the funny thing is people sort of treat me like, they come to me like, what's his name who came to Jesus in the night? Who came to Jesus in the night?
Oh, Nicodemus.
Nicodemus in the night. People will come up to me and they'll say, yeah, thank you. Somebody said Nicodemus. Thank you. They'll come up to me and they go, I'm really grateful for all that you do. But it's like private, and it's like, we need more people who are willing to go out there. But golly, we know that, and my I don't want to say this. I'm not going to say this. But I am worried about people being unable to strike out, and to tell the truth. Robbie George came to me many years ago and said that I wrote a lot about this at Breitbart. That some people from JP Morgan Chase had reached out to him. There was a company-wide survey. Company-wide. This is the 4th largest financial services company in the world, sent out a survey to all employees. And one of the questions was, are you LGBT or an ally?
There you go.
And they were afraid, they were wondering, how do we answer this question? Because I'm neither. And so they were afraid of losing promotions, losing jobs, re-education, the whole thing. So the corporations have gone wild on this.
It's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle, and it's hard. I don't know. I mean, is there a way to stem the tide? At this point, I would say, the end runs around these corrupt institutions. One thing that our side has going for it is that, the totalitarian left is always rewarding like mediocrity. I mean, you're not going to find, the brilliant minds among them, really. I mean, there'll be clever people who know how to, manipulate, but you're not going to find a whole lot of real insight that is really the strength of our side once we're able to see a problem and work through it. So that's something, because this, you look at how K-12 educrats have made a point of squashing natural curiosity, not teaching content knowledge, really intellectually lobotomizing kids so that they become, quote, woke, because everything is emotional. They've had their capacity to think stolen from them. And all they know is that they're going to be rejected by their peers if they just don't go along with this stuff. So that's eventually this kind of burns itself out, but does a huge amount of damage in the interim.
Well, one thing you discover on social media is that these people really cannot argue their case. And the reason is because they don't allow debate in their own lives, and so they don't learn how to make their case. That this is why they go to name calling so rapidly, because they get frustrated, and you just ask them a half a dozen questions, and they can't answer. This phrase, this nonsensical phrase, "love is love." I'd love to ask these people who use that on social media, what about an adult? What about an adult father and a father and his adult son? Love is love? Can they have a relationship? And they go, "Oh, well, no, we're against incest." Well, then love is not love, is it? So it's just like a couple of questions deep, and they're flummoxed. There are many bright spots, though. This love and fidelity network that grew out of some kids at Princeton University is now in a number of Ivy League schools. This St. Augustine Institute, I think is what it's called, is planting think tanks around the country. There is a groundswell of smart, engaged people who were young, also old. In the Second World War, John Paul II, under the tutelage of his mentor, started these rosary circles where people met privately, and they put on plays and things like that. There's an awful lot that people can do. If people don't want to step into the limelight, they can donate their money to organizations that are stepping into the limelight, like mine, but many others. The thing about it is that people have to do something. It is not enough to say, "Oh, woe is me. What are we going to do? We should retreat behind gated communities." There's so much to do. Are you concerned about pornography? There are groups that work on pornography. Are you concerned about the life issue? There's lots of pro-life organizations you can give to or volunteer to. There's just so much wrong in the world that there's very little you have to do to make it a little bit better. And you don't have to stick your head out of the foxhole. We welcome you because we need you. But if you feel that you cannot do that, write a check every month. There's so much that people can do.
Yeah, that's right. Going back to what you were saying, in response to like the love is love in your example, so much of this with these folks is about timing. There will come a time when incest isn't an issue, and it has. New York Magazine, I think, ran a couple of stories about, or even pedophilia. This is why, I think that you need to kind of get ahead of it all by just what you were doing at that time, mentioning, a situation that that they weren't on board with yet, or they didn't feel the public was on board with yet. But with them, it's all about timing. And when they get what they want, anything goes. And so, you always have to kind of be aware of that. But that's right. There are a lot of things people can do. You just have to be aware that there is a huge attack on privacy. They want to get rid of, cash, and just make every purchase trackable, traceable. There's so many things with, this war on private life. It's really a war on family intimacy. It's a war on personal relationships. It's a war on friendship. In so many ways, it's all about creating hostilities, but people can break away from that. They just have to become aware, get connected, on a very, one-on-one beginning, scale, and, help with that ripple effect. But also be very vigilant.
Let me ask you
mean,
this. What if you could name 2 or 3 books that you would recommend to people to get smart on this particular issue of political correctness, social isolation, propaganda? What would you recommend?
Oh my goodness, there are so many. One that I like is, now this is very interesting. Doris Lessing was a Nobel laureate. I think she won the prize in 2007 for literature and died a couple of years later after that. But maybe it was 2013. I don't remember exactly. But she wrote, well, she had a series of talks she gave that were put into book form. It's a small book, like maybe 70 pages, 77 pages, 5 talks, called Prisons We Choose to Live Inside. And it was really about how freedom had to be fought for. And she covers the issue of how easily seduced we are by the mobs. And how we have to, resist that as individuals. Okay, so there's that one. Margaret Thayer Singer's book, Cults in Our Midst. I love Drew Smirlu's Rape of the Mind. That really gives a really good deep dive into what's going on with the totalitarian mindset and how susceptible we are to it. Those are 3, and I'm sure there are many more. I would love to start a book club that is just on this theme of social isolation, propaganda, not just a book club, but discussion group where you could talk about movies on that theme or, articles where people can become more aware of how easily they're manipulated psychologically.
I thought that you did have a reading group.
I did.
Online a couple of years ago.
Well, it wasn't really online. I had my own personal blog, which I haven't kept up very well, but the personal blog, I had a little section called Bookcase where I talked about some of these books. I also did a book club, in-person book club a couple of years ago where we met monthly and talked about books and articles. We even had a couple, like a little documentary here and there. On this theme, and oh my goodness, people just, they just open up. I mean, you can barely talk about anything because everybody's just bursting at the seams with their personal experiences of how they were, shunned for saying that, oh, isn't that a nice tree? Or, it's just, it's something that I think people are hungering for. And I'm hopeful that I can put together a guidebook that would help people, like with a little bibliography and, help people get started in forming these kinds of groups where you can talk about talking,
right.
Talk about conversation.
One of the things that I hammer with my daughters, especially when we're watching movies, but also generally, is that, and this appeals, I think, innately to young people, we are the rebels.
Yeah.
We are the rebels.
That's
in
right.
Star Wars, we're the rebels. It's like we do not dominate the culture. We are my ancestor Aaron Ruse fought in the Revolutionary War. They hid behind rocks and took potshots at the British. We are the rebels. And I think that this is very appealing to young people, especially when they see the mob in action. We've got like 2 minutes left. Have you seen these videos of this young woman named Caitlin Bennett, who's called Gun Girl? I bet you never have.
No, I don't think so.
Look up Gun Girl on YouTube. She became famous a few years ago when she graduated from Kent State University, and her graduation picture was her holding an an AR-15, and she became known as Gun Girl. And then she joined this website called Liberty Hangout, and the videos of her going on to this campus, for instance, of Ohio State University, and asking, some of these man on the street interviews about how much students know about American history or whatever. She is so well known that within minutes, she's surrounded by, I'm telling you, hundreds of students who were screaming at her and screaming for blood, and she has to be escorted off campus by her bodyguards. It is quite an amazing thing to watch this brave young woman drive these people crazy. And I have to think that her example is very inspiring to some of the students who may agree with her, but are not quite so brave.
Oh, you can bet. You can bet. Yeah, no, in every group there's going to be, and you know, if she hadn't said anything, you never know who's going to be emboldened by something like that.
That's right. That's right. You know, there's I write a little bit about martyrdom in my upcoming book, and okay, I can't talk to you. I learned something recently from my friend Matt Meehan, who is the dean of the graduate school at Hillsdale College, Washington, D.C. And he said that, remember the image of those martyrs on the beach in Egypt who were then had their throat cut by the Islamists? One of the men kneeling who was martyred was actually one of the tormentors. He was so moved by the bravery and example of the Christians who were willing to die that he joined them.
Yeah.
And I was not aware that this is a thing throughout history. People who have been among the tormentors have joined the tormented because they are so inspired by the bravery and faith of the people who are about to be martyred. And that at the moment of martyrdom, angels are all around you. And anyway, I have been inspired by Matt and Meehan to look more about into martyrs. And, you know, we're not called to be martyrs. We're not called to be red martyrs. We're not called to be white martyrs. But sometimes you have no choice. You have no choice. Anyway, I consider this to be a glorious time to be alive, precisely because everything is so difficult. And that's the theme of my next book is, you know, God knows what he's about. And he sent the likes of us here right now to do battle for his creation. And therefore it is an amazing blessing and an honor. So Stella, I want to thank you on behalf of our crowd here who have tuned in today. I want everybody to know that this has been recorded. We will put it up on our website. We are going to have another one of these next month where I'm going to have Stefano Gennarini of CFAM and Rebecca Oas of CFAM to come on and talk about what has happened this fall in the General Assembly. Many victories, some defeats, but we want to bring everybody up to date on what's going on at the UN. Stella, thank you.
Thank you very much, Austin.